There are moments in life that carry the weight of centuries, moments when the past and the present meet face to face, not in conflict, but in understanding. I remember one such day vividly, the day I met Queen Elizabeth. It was not merely an encounter between two figures of history, but between two souls shaped by time, by duty, and by destiny. We came from worlds divided by oceans and by struggle. Yet in that meeting, something far deeper was present: the power of respect, the strength of forgiveness, and the quiet triumph of humanity. When I looked into her eyes, I did not see a monarch. I saw a person who, like all of us, bore the weight of her nation's story. And perhaps she saw in me not just a former prisoner or a president, but a man who refused to let bitterness define his heart. That day, I was reminded that true power is not found in crowns or titles, but in the courage to understand one another, even after centuries of misunderstanding. As we spoke, I felt the past tremble and the future whisper. The chains of history loosened, not through speeches or agreements, but through simple human grace, the kind that bridges, divides, the kind that heals. And I realized then, my friends, that when two people meet with open hearts, they carry the hope of millions. For respect can turn history's darkest pages into lessons, and forgiveness can transform old wounds into new beginnings. That meeting was more than a chapter in my life. It was a reminder to the world that no matter how deep the scars of division run, there is always room for reconciliation, always space for light to enter where once there was only shadow. When I met Queen Elizabeth, the world saw a president and a queen standing side by side, symbols of history, of nations, of power. But in that quiet room, away from the gaze of the world, I did not see her as a monarch draped in the symbols of empire, and she did not see me as a man once bound by chains. We were simply two human beings, each shaped by different worlds, yet bound by a shared desire for understanding. It was a meeting that transcended titles, a moment that reminded me that dignity does not come from the crown upon one's head or the office one holds, but from the humanity within one's heart. As I stood before her, I thought of the long and painful history between our peoples, centuries of struggle, of injustice, of voices silenced by the weight of colonial power. I had lived through the harsh reality of apartheid, where my people were denied the very rights that define a person's worth. And now I found myself face to face with a figure who represented a nation that once cast its shadow over ours. But I did not carry bitterness with me into that room. I carried purpose. For I had long learned that freedom is not achieved through vengeance, but through understanding. When Queen Elizabeth extended her hand, I saw not the hand of an empire, but the gesture of a woman who sought peace, who wished to bridge the divides of the past with grace. Her demeanor was calm, her words careful but kind, and I realized that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in commanding armies or ruling nations, but in listening, truly listening to the stories of those who once stood on the other side of history. Our conversation flowed not as leaders discussing treaties, but as individuals sharing reflections on life, on duty, on the burdens of leadership. She spoke of service, of the expectations placed upon her from a young age, and I spoke of the pain and the hope that shaped my people's journey toward liberation. In that exchange, there was no room for pride, only respect. I saw in her the same quiet strength I had seen in the mothers of South Africa, those who endured years of separation, loss, and struggle, yet held on to their humanity with unbreakable faith. It became clear to me that leadership, at its heart, is not about the power we command, but the empathy we extend. We often forget that behind every title lies a human being, capable of compassion, capable of change. And in that meeting, I was reminded that the world can only heal when those who hold power learn to meet not as rulers, but as equals, as people. I reflected on how easy it is for humanity to build walls of race, class, and status, and how difficult it is to tear them down. Yet that day, one such wall trembled. The crown and the prison uniform, the empire and the oppressed, all faded for a moment, replaced by a profound truth that our shared humanity is greater than the history that divides us. I could not help but think of the generations that came before me, the men and women who fought for dignity, who endured oppression, who dreamed of a day when equality would not be a slogan, but a reality. Meeting Queen Elizabeth was not a triumph of one man's journey. It was a symbol of their endurance, a silent tribute to their struggle. It showed that reconciliation is possible, even between those once separated by pain and power. Forgiveness does not erase the past, but it gives us the strength to face it without hatred. And as we spoke, I felt that the past was not a chain around our feet, but a lesson in our hands, a lesson that reminded us of our duty to lead with compassion, to build bridges where others built barriers. I left that meeting not with memories of royal ceremony, but with a renewed faith in dialogue in the power of respect to transform even the heaviest of histories. For when we meet each other beyond our titles, beyond the illusions of superiority, we begin to see what truly matters: character, kindness, and the courage to forgive. That encounter reaffirmed my belief that no matter how great the division between nations or people, understanding is always within reach. It begins with humility, the willingness to look another person in the eye and see not their title, but their truth. When the world later spoke of that meeting, many saw it as a political gesture, a sign of reconciliation between nations. But for me, it was more personal, more profound. It was a reminder that even in a world built on power, humanity remains the most powerful force of all. For it is not our crowns or offices that define us, but the respect we show to one another. That day with Queen Elizabeth was not about the past, nor was it merely about two leaders shaking hands. It was about the timeless truth that leadership is service, and service begins with understanding. When we strip away our titles, our pride, and our fears, we discover that we are all the same, bound by the same hopes, the same sorrows, and the same dreams for a better tomorrow. And so, I tell you this story, not to celebrate a moment of grandeur, but to remind you that even the mightiest walls can fall before the power of humanity. Whether you are a king or a commoner, a ruler or a dreamer, remember this: it is only when we meet each other as human beings that we truly meet at all. The weight of history is not carried in books or monuments alone. It lives within the hearts of those who have suffered and those who have caused suffering. When I think about the day I met Queen Elizabeth, I do not see it merely as a meeting between two leaders, but as a moment when the echoes of centuries stood still. For behind that polite exchange and warm greeting lay the deep, complicated history between our nations, a history shaped by empire, by inequality, and by pain. Yet that day was not one of resentment. It was one of courage, the courage to forgive, the courage to face the shadows of the past without letting them define the future. I had spent 27 long years in prison, and in those years I had time to think about what freedom truly meant. Freedom, I learned, was not just the absence of chains. It was the presence of peace within one's soul. To emerge from captivity with anger in my heart would have been to remain imprisoned still. So, when the opportunity came to meet the queen of a nation that once ruled over mine, I knew that this moment carried the weight of more than diplomacy. It was a test of whether forgiveness could stand where bitterness once stood, whether unity could rise where division had been planted for generations. I did not walk into that room as a victim of history. I walked in as a witness to its lessons. The history between Africa and the British Crown was not one of equality. It was one of domination and struggle. But I had come to understand that holding on to anger only strengthens the chains we seek to break. If we are to move forward as a people, we must find the strength to confront the past, not to erase it, but to transform it. The courage to forgive is not the absence of memory. It is the triumph of wisdom over bitterness. As I greeted Queen Elizabeth, I saw not an enemy, but a symbol of change, a woman who had inherited a complex legacy, just as I had inherited the scars of it. The power of that moment was not in the words we spoke, but in the silence that acknowledged everything our nations had endured. It was a silence that carried the pain of colonization, the cries of those who were denied dignity, and the unspoken hope that the future could be different. History teaches us that human beings are capable of both great cruelty and great compassion. And it is compassion, not cruelty, that defines the measure of our humanity. I had seen what hatred could do, how it divides, how it destroys, how it blinds even the most intelligent of minds. But I had also seen the quiet power of forgiveness, how it heals, how it restores, how it builds bridges where once there were only walls. When I looked at the Queen, I thought of my people, men and women, who had endured so much and yet carried themselves with dignity. I thought of those who died for freedom, not to replace one oppressor with another, but to create a world where respect would not depend on the color of one's skin, And in that reflection, I knew that forgiveness was not surrender. It was the ultimate expression of strength. For centuries, the African people were told they were lesser, their voices silenced, their land taken, their cultures diminished. But there we stood, no longer as subject and ruler, but as equal. That was the victory not of one man or one nation, but of the human spirit itself. The courage it takes to forgive does not erase history, but it redeems it. It allows us to rise above its chains and write new chapters filled with understanding, not vengeance. The weight of history can crush us if we let it. It can shape our identity in bitterness and make us prisoners of our own pain. But when we confront it with open hearts, when we choose to forgive without forgetting, it becomes a teacher. It shows us the cost of division and the priceless value of unity. That day, in the presence of the Queen, I felt the heavy burden of our shared past lighten, not because the past had changed, but because our hearts had. Forgiveness, I have learned, is not about forgetting what was done. It is about refusing to be consumed by it. It is a conscious choice to rise above vengeance and seek peace. Instead, the courage to forgive does not make one weak. It is the highest form of strength, for it demands that we confront pain without letting it rule us. That meeting was not about the exchange of words between two figures of state. It was about the silent understanding that both of us carried the weight of our histories and the hope of our peoples. It was about demonstrating to the world that reconciliation is possible, even between those whose ancestors stood on opposite sides of history. When I walked away from that meeting, I carried with me a renewed faith, not in politics or power, but in people. The same human capacity that creates division also holds the power to heal it. The chains that once bound us to the past can become the links that bind us together in understanding. So I say to all who carry the scars of history, do not let the past imprison your spirit. Learn from it, but do not live within it. Have the courage to forgive, for in forgiveness lies freedom. The weight of history is heavy, but when carried with grace, it becomes not a burden, but a bridge. That is what I felt when I met Queen Elizabeth. Two worlds, once divided, meeting not in bitterness, but in hope. A moment when the past bowed before the future, and forgiveness stood tall, unshaken, unbroken, and victorious. There is a power that does not come from wealth, titles, or the authority to command others. It is a power that cannot be inherited or bought. It is the power of dignity, the quiet strength that comes from knowing your worth and recognizing the worth of others. When I speak of equality, I do not speak of a dream that belongs to one nation or one people. I speak of the essence of humanity itself, the belief that every man, every woman, regardless of color or station, has the right to stand tall, to be respected, and to live a life of freedom and purpose. Throughout my life, I have seen how easily human beings are divided by illusions, illusions of superiority, of privilege, of control. I have seen men believe They are greater because of the color of their skin or the position they hold. But I have also seen how fragile that illusion becomes when it stands before the truth of equality. For true leadership is not found in those who command obedience, but in those who earn respect. It is not defined by the power to rule, but by the courage to serve. When I was imprisoned, stripped of title, stripped of comfort, and isolated from the world, I learned what dignity truly meant. They could confine my body, but they could not touch my spirit. They could silence my voice, but not my beliefs. That was dignity, the refusal to surrender one's humanity, even in the face of humiliation. In those long years behind bars, I saw men broken, yet I also saw men rise. They rose not because they were powerful, but because they refused to be defined by their circumstances. Equality was not something granted to them by others. It was something they carried within themselves. When I met leaders, kings, and presidents later in my life, I never bowed to their crowns or their offices, but I did bow to their humanity when it was guided by humility, compassion, and justice. When I met Queen Elizabeth, I saw not a monarch who ruled over millions, but a woman who carried the weight of service upon her shoulders. I respected her not because of her crown, but because of her grace. That meeting reminded me that dignity recognizes dignity and respect honors respect. In the end, we are all equals before time, before destiny, and before the truth of our actions. I have often said that there is no freedom without equality, but there is also no equality without dignity. One cannot exist without the other. To treat another person as lesser is to deny your own humanity, for we are reflections of one another. The chains that bind one group eventually bind all of us. The world has known too much suffering, born from arrogance, the arrogance of thinking one race superior to another, one nation destined to rule others, one person entitled to more life, more hope, more respect. But history has taught us that the strongest empires fall, the proudest crowns fade, and only justice endures. True equality is not achieved through laws alone. It must live in the hearts of people. It begins in the way we look at one another, not through the lens of class or color, but through the eyes of understanding. When I think of the journey of my people from oppression to freedom, I know that dignity was our shield and equality was our goal. We did not fight to be above others. We fought to stand beside them. We did not seek revenge. We sought recognition. The simple acknowledgement that we, too, were human, deserving of respect and opportunity. I have walked among the rich and the poor, the mighty and the forgotten, and I have found one truth that never fails. Greatness is not measured by how high you stand, but by how gently you reach down. The true test of leadership is how one treats those with no power at all. A leader who forgets that is a ruler in name only. For the greatest victory any leader can achieve is not conquest over others, but mastery over the self, the conquest of ego, of pride and of the need to dominate. There were times when I stood before people who once saw me as less than human. They held power in their hands, political power, military power, economic power, yet they lacked the one thing that gives all power meaning, the moral strength to see equality as truth. But even in those moments, I did not hate them. I pitied them, for I knew that a man who must crush another to feel strong has already lost his dignity. When we understand that dignity and equality are not gifts to be given but rights to be honored, the world changes. The divisions that once seemed unbreakable begin to fade. Nations can reconcile, enemies can shake hands, and people who once stood on opposite sides of history can walk together toward the future. It is not an easy journey, but it is the only one worth taking. Each of us has a role to play in upholding dignity in our homes, our communities, and our nations. Every act of kindness, every word of respect, every choice to listen rather than judge strengthens the foundation of equality. The small gestures matter as much as the great ones, for it is in the everyday acts of respect that humanity is truly built. So when I speak to you about dignity and equality, I am not speaking of ideas written in speeches or carved in stone. I am speaking of the living spirit that must exist in all of us, the spirit that refuses to be diminished, that sees value in every person, and that believes no one is beneath another. The world will not be healed by anger or pride, but by respect, by the recognition that our fates are bound together. And so, my friends, remember this: titles fade, riches vanish, and power shifts from one hand to another, but dignity endures, equality endures. These are the true crowns of humanity, invisible yet unbreakable. The leader who understands this leads not just a nation, but the soul of mankind. There are moments in life when words become more than sound. They become bridges between hearts. When I first spoke with Queen Elizabeth, I felt that kind of power, the quiet strength of dialogue, born not from authority, but from grace. It was not a conversation between ruler and rebel, between monarch and former prisoner. It was a meeting between two people who had seen the tides of history and understood that true leadership is not about dominance, but understanding. In her voice, I had curiosity, patience, and respect. And in that space, I realized that dialogue, when guided by humility, has the strength to heal wounds that centuries of conflict have created. Our meeting was calm, almost serene, yet beneath the simplicity of our words rested the weight of generations. We did not need to speak about power. It was already written in the world around us. What mattered was how we used it to divide or to unite, to wound or to heal. She asked about South Africa, about our journey toward freedom, about the dreams and struggles of our people. And I listened as she spoke of her life of duty, of her hope for a world that would rise above its history. It was a moment of reflection between two lives shaped by very different paths. yet drawn together by a shared desire to build something better than what came before. I have always believed that dialogue is one of the most powerful tools of peace. It requires courage, the courage to listen, to admit that you do not hold all the answers, and to open your heart to another's truth. When I spoke to Queen Elizabeth, I saw that same courage in her. She carried herself with grace, but not the kind born from privilege. It was the grace of understanding, the grace that comes from realizing that kindness is not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. Throughout my life, I have seen how people build walls between each other with their words. They use them to separate, to insult, to claim superiority. But that day, I saw words used differently. They became threads, weaving together respect and trust. We spoke as representatives of nations.